terrifying thing about a legend is that people forget there was ever a human being underneath it. They see the photographs, the millions of records, the screaming crowds, the diamonds, the television appearances, the white jumpsuits, the name, Elvis Presley. But on one rainy night in Nashville, that name became almost impossible for the man himself to carry. April 3rd, 1971. Nashville Municipal Auditorium was overflowing. Thousands of people had packed into the building, their coats damp from the rain outside, their voices mixing with cigarette smoke, perfume, hot television lights, and the restless electricity of a crowd that knew it was watching something important. But nobody knew just how important. Nobody knew that before the night was over, two of America's biggest musical legends would stand beneath the same lights and expose wounds they had spent years hiding. And nobody, not even Johnny Cash, fully understood what would happen when he looked across that auditorium and made a dare that could not be taken back. Backstage, Elvis Presley stood alone. The mirror in front of him reflected everything the world thought it wanted. Perfect black suit, dark sunglasses, carefully styled hair, the face millions recognized instantly. But Elvis wasn't looking at the celebrity. He was looking at the man underneath, and he barely recognized him. His hands were trembling. He pressed them against the edge of the dressing table, hoping the shaking would stop. It didn't. For days, he had barely slept. His life had become a machine that never shut down. 2 shows a night, airplanes, hotels, business meetings, cameras, people constantly asking for something. A photograph, a handshake, a performance, a smile, another song, another appearance, another night, pretending everything was fine. The world called him the king. But sometimes, alone in a hotel room after the lights went out, Elvis wondered who exactly was supposed to rule all of this. Because he felt less like a king every day. He felt trapped. His fingers slowly reached into the pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a small silver cross. The metal was worn from years of being touched. He rubbed his thumb across it, and suddenly, the room disappeared. For one brief second, he wasn't in Nashville. He was back in Tupelo. A little boy, a tiny church, wooden benches, warm summer air, and his mother, Gladys. He could almost hear her voice, soft, gentle, singing a gospel hymn while she worked around the house. Elvis closed his eyes. His chest tightened. He whispered so quietly that even the mirror could barely hear him. "Help me through tonight, Mama." A knock interrupted him. "5 minutes, Mr. Presley." Elvis quickly opened his eyes. The memory disappeared. The performer returned. He put the cross back into his pocket. Then he looked at himself one last time. "Let's go." Outside, the auditorium erupted. Johnny Cash had stepped onto the stage. The applause was enormous. Johnny walked beneath the lights beside June Carter and the Statler brothers. The audience saw the famous man in black. But Johnny wasn't thinking about himself. His eyes were searching the crowd. And then he found him, Elvis, sitting among the people, smiling, clapping, looking exactly like the superstar everyone expected. But Johnny knew better. He had known darkness himself. He knew what addiction could do. He knew shame. He knew the terrible silence of hotel rooms after midnight. He knew what it felt like to wake up and wonder whether you had finally gone too far. He knew what it meant to smile for an audience while something inside you was falling apart. And when Johnny looked at Elvis that night, he recognized the expression immediately. It wasn't exhaustion. It was disappearance. Elvis was still physically there, but something inside him seemed to be fading. Johnny watched him for several seconds. Then his expression changed. June noticed. She knew her husband. She leaned slightly toward him. What are you thinking?" Johnny didn't answer. The performance continued. The crowd laughed. The band played. The cameras rolled. But Johnny kept looking toward Elvis. And the more he looked, the more certain he became. He couldn't simply walk away. The performance ended. The audience exploded into applause. Johnny was supposed to leave the stage. Instead, he stayed. He slowly returned to the microphone. The applause began fading. June looked at him. She knew that expression. Johnny was about to do something that wasn't planned. Something dangerous. Something personal. Johnny placed both hands around the microphone. "You know," his voice was quieter now, "there's somebody here tonight who changed music forever." The crowd immediately began cheering. People turned toward Elvis. Elvis smiled. That automatic smile. The smile he had perfected over years. But Johnny wasn't smiling. He looked directly at him. Before the fame, Johnny paused. Before the screaming crowds. Another pause. Before Hollywood. He looked toward Elvis. There was just a boy. The auditorium became quieter. A boy who sang gospel music beside his mama. Elvis stopped smiling. His fingers tightened around his knees. "No, Johnny, don't," Johnny continued. "And I think it's a tragedy." His voice became heavier. "That the world forgot what that man's voice sounds like when he sings for God instead of money." The atmosphere changed instantly. The audience leaned forward. Elvis lowered his head. Nearby, Colonel Tom Parker's expression hardened. This wasn't planned. Johnny looked straight at Elvis. Then he said the words that would change the entire night. "Elvis." A pause. "I dare you." The auditorium went completely silent. "I dare you to come up here tonight." Johnny's eyes never left him. "And sing gospel the way you used to sing it before the world got hold of you." Elvis felt the blood drain from his face. Johnny wasn't finished. "I dare you to sing like that little boy from Tupelo again." Elvis stared at the floor. His heart was pounding. Then Johnny delivered the final blow. "I dare you," he paused, "to sing for your mama." Everything stopped. The noise, the lights, the room. For Elvis, the entire world seemed to disappear. "Mama, not her. Please, not her." For 13 years, Elvis had kept that grief locked away. 13 years since Gladys had died. 13 years of avoiding the songs that reminded him too much of her. 13 years of pretending that the pain had become smaller. It hadn't. He had simply become better at hiding it. His eyes closed. He could see her. He could hear her. He could feel the old ache returning. Part of him wanted to stand up and leave. Another part wanted to turn around and tell Johnny Cash never to mention his mother again. But somewhere underneath the anger was something else. Something he had been starving for. A chance to remember who he had been before fame. Before the machines. Before the expectations. Before everyone started telling him who Elvis Presley was supposed to be. Johnny didn't say another word. He simply waited. Like a man standing beside an open door. Elvis slowly stood. The audience gasped. Not applause. Not screaming. Shock. He stepped into the aisle. Every camera turned toward him. Every eye followed him. His legs felt heavier with every step. It felt less like walking toward a stage, and more like walking toward a grave he had spent 13 years avoiding. He reached the stairs. Johnny extended his hand. Elvis looked at it. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he grabbed it. Johnny leaned closer. The microphones couldn't hear what he whispered. "You don't have to be Elvis tonight." A pause. "Just be honest." Elvis looked at him. Those words hit deeper than the dare. He slowly walked to the center of the stage. The band waited. The audience waited. Johnny stepped aside. Elvis stood alone beneath the lights. He looked toward the microphone, then down at his hands. They were shaking. "If I do this—" His voice was barely audible. He swallowed. "I gotta do it the way Mama taught me." Nobody moved. The band didn't play. The audience didn't breathe. Elvis closed his eyes, and suddenly he wasn't 36 anymore. He was 8. Tupelo, a little church, wooden pews, summer heat. His mother's voice beside him. A simple hymn. A small boy singing because singing was the only thing he knew how to do when life became difficult. Elvis opened his eyes. He stepped closer to the microphone. And then he began. Amazing grace. His voice cracked. Immediately. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the voice of the king. It was the voice of a grieving son. A sharp tremor ran through the auditorium. Elvis took a breath. How sweet the sound. His voice shook again. People stopped moving. The laughter was gone. The celebrity was gone. The sunglasses no longer mattered. The suit no longer mattered. There was only a man standing beneath a light, carrying 13 years of grief in his chest. That saved a wretch. He struggled to continue. Like me. His eyes closed, and something inside him finally broke open. Every year, every memory, every regret, every lonely night, every moment he wished he could hear his mother's voice one more time. It all entered the song. The audience didn't hear a performance. They heard pain. And Johnny Cash knew immediately. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was confession. Johnny stood at the side of the stage. Tears began filling his eyes. He didn't wipe them away, because he suddenly understood something. He had made the dare, but he had no idea how much pain he was asking Elvis to uncover. And now Johnny was watching a man confront the darkness he himself had spent years fighting. The song continued. Elvis's voice broke, recovered, broke again. But every time it broke, he kept singing. And slowly, something extraordinary began happening. The weakness became strength. The trembling became power. The pain became music. Elvis opened his eyes. For the first time that night, he wasn't looking at the audience. He wasn't looking at the cameras. He wasn't thinking about his career. He was remembering. And somewhere in the middle of the hymn, Johnny Cash stepped toward the microphone. He couldn't stay silent anymore. Elvis was singing alone. But Johnny knew exactly what the song was saying. It was saying, "I am tired. I am hurting. I don't know how much longer I can carry this." And Johnny knew that language. He had spoken it himself. So he walked forward, slowly, one step, then another, until he stood beside Elvis. The audience watched. Elvis continued singing. Johnny took a breath and joined him. His deep voice entered beneath Elvis's trembling melody. The effect was immediate. Two legends. Two wounded men. Two voices carrying completely different kinds of pain. But somehow, they fit. The auditorium became utterly silent. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. An elderly man lowered his head. Someone began crying. Then another. The cameras kept rolling. But nobody backstage was thinking about ratings anymore. Because something had happened that couldn't be rehearsed. It couldn't be manufactured. It couldn't be sold. For the first time that night, Elvis Presley wasn't performing for America. He was singing to his mother. And Johnny Cash wasn't singing for an audience. He was standing beside a brother who was hurting. The two voices continued rising, and the rain outside kept falling against the windows. But inside that auditorium, it felt like time had stopped, and neither man yet knew that the next verse would break them both. because Johnny had dared Elvis to remember the boy from Tupelo. But, in remembering that boy, Elvis was about to uncover a pain he had spent 13 years trying to bury. And Johnny Cash was about to realize that he had opened a door that neither of them would ever be able to close again. The next verse began without warning. Elvis stood beneath the lights, his eyes closed, his hand trembling slightly beside the microphone. Johnny Cash remained only a few feet away. Neither man moved, neither man smiled. The audience had become so quiet that the faint hum of the television equipment could be heard from the back of the auditorium. Then Elvis sang again. This time, his voice was deeper, more fragile, and somehow more powerful. Every word seemed to carry a memory, a childhood he could never return to, a mother he could never hear again, a life that existed before the world discovered his name. Johnny listened, and something inside him began breaking too, because he knew that sound. He knew what it meant when a man wasn't simply singing words. He was trying to survive them. Johnny's eyes filled with tears. He looked toward June. She stood near the side of the stage. The moment she saw her husband's face, she knew. Johnny wasn't just emotional. He was remembering the addiction, the darkness, the nights he had nearly destroyed himself, the moments when he had wondered whether he would wake up the next morning. He had spent years fighting those memories. But now, Elvis's voice was pulling them back into the light. Johnny lowered his head. A tear fell. Then another. And Elvis noticed. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Neither man needed to explain anything. They understood each other. That was the strange thing about pain. Sometimes the people who had survived the same darkness could recognize it without a single word. Elvis continued singing. His voice cracked again. But this time, he didn't try to hide it. He let it happen. The audience heard the imperfection. And somehow, that imperfection made the moment more beautiful. Because the world had spent years hearing Elvis Presley sound perfect. Perfect records, perfect performances, perfect smiles, perfect photographs. But nobody had ever needed him to be perfect more than he had needed himself. Tonight, he finally stopped trying. He took a breath. His chest rose sharply. Then he sang another line. His voice became almost a whisper. Johnny stepped closer. He didn't interrupt. He simply stood beside him, like a brother standing beside another brother at a funeral. Then Johnny quietly added his voice. The harmony was almost painfully beautiful. Elvis's voice sounded wounded. Johnny's sounded weathered. One carried grief. The other carried survival. Together, they created something neither man could have created alone. The audience was crying openly now. An elderly woman near the front pressed both hands against her heart. A young couple held each other's hands. A man in the balcony removed his hat and lowered his head. Nobody cared about celebrity anymore. They were watching two human beings. And that was what made the moment so powerful. Then Elvis reached the line that almost stopped him completely. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He swallowed, tried again. His voice cracked. He looked down. For several seconds, he couldn't continue. Johnny immediately turned toward him. Elvis! The microphone barely caught the word. Elvis shook his head. I'm okay. But he wasn't. Johnny knew it. Everyone knew it. Elvis looked toward the ceiling, and suddenly he remembered the hospital room, his mother's face, the silence, the terrible realization that he would never hear her voice again. He remembered standing there as a young man who had become famous faster than he could understand. People wanted Elvis, But his mother wanted her son, and he had never stopped wondering whether fame had taken something from him that could never be returned. His eyes opened. Tears were running down his cheeks. He looked toward the audience. "I miss her." The words were almost too quiet to hear, but the microphone caught them. The auditorium reacted with a collective breath. Elvis looked down. "I still miss her." Johnny's eyes closed. June covered her mouth. Elvis continued. "Every time I sing one of these songs," he paused, "I hear her." His voice broke. "And sometimes," he struggled to continue, "I don't know if that's a blessing or a punishment." The room became completely still. No one had expected this. Not the producers, not the audience, not even Johnny. Elvis had gone far beyond the performance. He was speaking directly from a place he had kept hidden for years. Johnny slowly stepped toward him. He placed a hand on Elvis's shoulder. "You don't have to carry it alone." Elvis looked at him. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Elvis nodded, and they continued. The song became something completely different. It was no longer about singing. It was about memory, about regret, about forgiveness, about two men trying to find their way back to themselves. Johnny's voice grew stronger. Elvis's voice trembled. Then Elvis found the strength again. The two voices rose together. The auditorium seemed to disappear. The television cameras were still filming. The lights were still burning. Thousands of people were still watching. But for Elvis and Johnny, none of it mattered. They were somewhere else. Somewhere far away from Nashville. Far away from fame. Far away from the people who needed them to be legends. They were simply two men standing beside each other, trying not to fall. Then Johnny began remembering his own mother, his father, his childhood, the hard years, the shame, the addiction, the nights when he had nearly lost everything. He remembered sitting alone in dark rooms. He remembered looking at his own reflection and wondering how the man everyone admired could be the same man who hated himself. He remembered June, her patience, her tears, her prayers, her refusal to give up on him. And suddenly, Johnny realized why Elvis's pain felt so familiar. Because Johnny had spent years running from the same question. Who are you when nobody is watching? The world knew Johnny Cash. But did Johnny know himself? He didn't have an answer. Not yet. The song continued. Elvis's voice rose again. This time, there was strength in it. Not the artificial strength of a performer. Something deeper. A man who had finally stopped running. The audience began standing. One person, then another. Then an entire section. Soon thousands were on their feet. But nobody applauded. They simply stood. It looked almost like a congregation. The stage lights seemed less like entertainment lights and more like something sacred. Johnny looked out at the audience. He saw people crying. He saw people holding each other. He saw strangers comforting strangers. And he realized something. Everyone in that room had a story. Everyone had lost someone. Everyone had regrets. Everyone had a room inside themselves they didn't like entering. And somehow, Elvis had opened the door. Then came the final verse. Elvis took a breath. Johnny looked at him. "You ready?" Elvis nodded. "Yeah." They began. This time, Elvis's voice didn't shake. It was still emotional, still rough, still wounded. But there was strength. The audience listened. Every word seemed to travel through the building. And then, suddenly, Elvis opened his eyes. He looked toward Johnny. The final words came. His voice cracked. Johnny immediately joined him. The two voices merged, and then the final note disappeared into silence. Nothing happened. For several seconds. No applause. No cheering. No movement. just silence. 8,000 people sat frozen. Johnny's chest was rising and falling rapidly. Elvis stared at the floor. His face was wet with tears. Then Elvis looked toward Johnny, and something inside Johnny collapsed. Tears streamed down his face. He turned away from the microphone. He couldn't hide it anymore. His shoulders began shaking. June immediately took a step forward, but Johnny tried to remain standing. He wiped his face. It didn't help. The audience saw everything. The famous man in black was crying. Not acting. Not performing. Crying. Elvis watched him, and instead of returning to his own place, he walked toward him. He placed both arms around Johnny. Johnny broke. He leaned into Elvis's shoulder. The entire auditorium gasped. Then the tears came harder. Johnny whispered something. The microphone barely caught it. "Thank you." Elvis held him tightly. "For what?" Johnny pulled back slightly. "For reminding me." "Of what?" Johnny looked at him. "Who I was." Elvis's face changed. Because he understood. He had needed the same reminder. June walked onto the stage. She approached Johnny carefully. He looked at her. For a second, he seemed ashamed. But June didn't judge him. She simply wrapped her arms around him. Johnny buried his face against her shoulder, and she held him. No embarrassment, no attempt to hide the tears, just love. Elvis watched them, and something inside him hurt. Not because he was jealous, because he suddenly realized how long it had been since someone had held him like that. His mother had. Once. Years ago. Before fame. Before everything became complicated. Elvis looked away. His jaw tightened. He swallowed. Then June looked toward him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She walked over and gently touched his arm. "You okay?" Elvis smiled weakly. "No." June nodded. "That's okay." Those 3 words nearly destroyed him, because nobody had said that to him in years. He had always been expected to be okay. Elvis Presley couldn't be tired. Elvis Presley couldn't be afraid. Elvis Presley couldn't be broken. Elvis Presley had to perform, but June looked at him like he was simply a man. And she said, "That's okay." Elvis looked down. Tears came again. The applause finally began. Slowly, softly, then louder. But it wasn't the screaming applause Elvis was used to. There were no wild cheers, no fans rushing forward, no celebration. It was different. It sounded like respect. People were applauding because they had witnessed something honest. Johnny finally stepped away from June. He wiped his face. Elvis walked back toward the microphone. The crowd quieted again. He looked out. His voice was almost a whisper. "My mama used to tell me something." He paused. "She used to say a man could have everything." He looked down and still lose himself. Nobody moved. Elvis touched the small cross inside his jacket. She was right. His voice cracked. "I just didn't understand it then." He looked toward Johnny. "Maybe I understand it now." Johnny nodded. Elvis continued. "You can have money." A pause. "You can have fame." Another pause. "You can have thousands of people screaming your name." His eyes filled again. "But none of that means anything." He touched his chest. "If you don't know who you are when the room gets quiet." The audience was completely silent. Elvis looked down. "And tonight?" He breathed deeply. The room got quiet. Backstage, several television producers were already panicking. They had expected a controlled performance. They had expected Elvis to sing. They had expected Johnny Cash to introduce him. They had expected applause. What they had not expected was this: a superstar crying. Johnny Cash crying, June Carter holding him, thousands of people standing in silence. The producers looked at one another. One of them whispered, "What are we supposed to do with this?" Nobody answered. Because there was nothing to do. You couldn't edit emotion out of a live moment. You couldn't rehearse it. You couldn't manufacture it. You couldn't sell it. It simply happened. But one man backstage wasn't moved. Colonel Tom Parker. His expression was cold. He watched the stage. He saw the tears. He saw Elvis exposing himself. And he hated every second. "This is a disaster," he muttered. One assistant looked at him nervously. "People seem to love it." Parker snapped, "They're supposed to love Elvis." He pointed toward the stage. "Not this." He didn't understand. Or perhaps he understood too well. Because if people saw Elvis as a human being, they might start demanding more honesty from him. And honesty was dangerous, especially for a man whose entire career had been built around controlling an image. The performance finally ended. The audience continued applauding. Elvis stood beside Johnny. Both men looked exhausted. But something had changed. Neither man could explain it. They simply knew. Johnny turned toward Elvis. "You all right?" Elvis breathed slowly. "I don't know." Johnny nodded. "Me neither." They both laughed quietly. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of two people who had just survived something they couldn't fully understand. Johnny extended his hand. Elvis took it. Then Johnny pulled him into another embrace. "You needed that." Elvis closed his eyes. "Yeah." A long pause. "I think I did." Johnny whispered, "So did I." They stood there for several seconds. Then June approached. The three of them stood together beneath the fading stage lights. And for a brief moment, there was no king, no man in black, no country star, no superstar, no cameras, just three human beings standing in the aftermath of something none of them would ever forget. But the hardest part of the night had not happened yet. Because when Elvis walked backstage, Colonel Parker was waiting. And the expression on his face told Elvis everything. Parker stepped forward. "What the hell was that?" Elvis stopped. He said nothing. Parker pointed toward the stage. "You don't do that." Elvis slowly looked at him. Parker continued. "You don't cry on television." Silence. "You don't talk about your mother." Another pause. "You don't tell the public you're lost." Elvis's jaw tightened. Parker lowered his voice. "You're Elvis Presley." For years, those words had controlled him. Tonight, they sounded different, like a cage. Elvis looked at Parker, then quietly said, "No." Parker froze. Elvis took a breath. "Tonight." He looked back toward the stage. "I was just Elvis." And for the first time in years, the man standing there didn't sound afraid. But outside that dressing room, Johnny Cash was waiting. Because Johnny had something important to tell him. Something that would turn one emotional performance into a moment neither man would ever forget. And when Johnny finally spoke, Elvis would realize that the dare had never really been about gospel music. It had been about something much more dangerous. It had been about saving a man before he disappeared completely. The hallway behind the stage was almost silent. Only a few minutes earlier, thousands of people had been on their feet, crying and applauding as Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash stood together beneath the lights. Now, the noise was gone. The cameras were being packed away. Crew members whispered in corners. Musicians carried instruments through narrow hallways. But Elvis barely noticed any of it. He walked slowly toward his dressing room, his shoulders heavy, his face exhausted. The performance had taken something out of him, something he couldn't put back. For 13 years, he had kept his mother's memory behind a locked door. Tonight, Johnny Cash had opened it. And now, everything was flooding out. Elvis stopped outside his dressing room. His hand reached for the doorknob. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Elvis. He turned. Johnny Cash stood several feet away. His eyes were still red. His face looked exhausted. But there was something different about him now, something calmer. Johnny walked closer. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Elvis whispered, "You shouldn't have done that." Johnny nodded. "I know." Elvis looked away. "You knew what that would do." Johnny sighed. "I suspected." "You knew." Johnny lowered his head. "Yeah." Elvis stared at him. For a moment, anger returned. "You put me in front of thousands of people." Johnny didn't defend himself. "You dragged my mother into it." "I know." "You knew I wasn't ready." Johnny looked directly at him. "No." Elvis frowned. "No?" Johnny shook his head. "I knew you were never going to be ready." Silence. That answer hit harder than an apology. Johnny continued. "Sometimes we wait our whole lives for the perfect moment to face something." He paused. "And sometimes the perfect moment never comes." Elvis looked down. Johnny's voice became softer. "I was afraid you'd walk away." "I almost did." "I know. I wanted to hate you." Johnny gave a small, sad smile. "You still can?" Elvis almost laughed. Almost. But the smile disappeared quickly. "I don't hate you." Johnny nodded. "Good." Elvis opened the dressing room door, then stopped. "Come inside." Johnny followed. The room was dim. No cameras, no managers, no audience. Just two chairs, a small table, a mirror, and the silence left behind after a storm. Elvis sat down. Johnny remained standing for a moment. Then he pulled out a cigarette. He looked at Elvis. "Mind?" Elvis shook his head. Johnny lit it. The flame briefly illuminated his tired face. Smoke slowly filled the room. Neither man spoke. Finally, Elvis broke the silence. "You know what scared me?" Johnny looked up. "I thought I was going to break." Johnny nodded. "But you didn't." Elvis shook his head. "I did." "No." "I did." Johnny leaned forward. "You broke open." Elvis stared at him. There was a difference. Johnny continued. "Breaking apart and breaking open aren't the same thing." Elvis looked toward the floor. He had never heard it described that way. Johnny took another breath. "When you sang tonight," he paused, "I saw something I haven't seen in a long time." "What?" Johnny answered quietly. "You." Elvis looked at him. "Not Elvis Presley." Johnny tapped his chest. "You." The room became silent again. Elvis reached into his jacket. He pulled out the small silver cross. Johnny looked at it. "Your mama's?" Elvis nodded. "She gave it to me." "When?" "Years before she died." Johnny looked at the cross. "Why do you carry it?" Elvis rubbed his thumb over the worn metal. "I don't know." Johnny smiled. "I think you do." Elvis looked at him. Johnny said, "You carry it because some part of you is still trying to get home." Elvis's eyes filled again. He quickly looked away. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Elvis whispered, "I don't know where home is anymore." Johnny's face changed. He understood. "Neither did I." Elvis looked up. Johnny continued. "That's why I kept running." "From what?" "Myself." The words were simple, but they carried years behind them. Johnny told Elvis about the nights when he disappeared, the pills, the drinking, the shame, the moments when June found him barely holding himself together. He told him about waking up terrified, about promising himself that he would change, then failing, again and again, until one day he realized something. The drugs weren't the real enemy, the emptiness was. Elvis listened without interrupting. Finally, he asked, "How did you stop?" Johnny looked at him. "I didn't do it alone." Elvis was silent. "June helped me." Johnny's voice softened. "She didn't fix me." He shook his head. "She stayed." That sentence hit Elvis deeply, because staying was something he desperately needed. Johnny leaned back. "You've got people around you." Elvis gave a bitter smile. "I've got thousands." Johnny shook his head. "That's not what I said." Elvis didn't answer. Johnny continued. "You need somebody who knows Elvis isn't the only man in the room." Silence. "You need people who can tell you when you're hurting." Elvis looked down. "People don't tell me anything." "Why?" "Because I'm Elvis." Johnny smiled sadly. "Exactly." The room became quiet. Then Elvis laughed softly. "That might be the saddest thing I've ever heard." Johnny nodded. "It is." Outside the dressing room, footsteps passed. Someone laughed. A door slammed. Life continued. But inside, time seemed frozen. Elvis stared into the mirror. For years, he had looked at that reflection and seen a character. The hair, the glasses, the clothes, the smile, the legend. Tonight, he saw something different. A tired man, a grieving son, a frightened human being. He touched his face. "Johnny." "Yeah?" "What happens tomorrow?" Johnny looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Tomorrow I wake up." A pause. "And everything starts again." Johnny didn't answer immediately. Elvis continued. "The shows, the planes, the hotels, the people, the pills." His voice became quieter. "The pretending." Johnny's expression hardened. "You don't have to pretend." Elvis looked at him. "Yes, I do." "No. You don't understand." Johnny leaned forward. "I understand more than you think." Elvis looked away. Johnny continued. "You think the world will collapse if Elvis Presley admits he's tired?" Elvis remained silent. "But maybe—" Johnny paused. "Maybe the world doesn't need another perfect Elvis." He looked directly at him. "Maybe it needs a real one." Those words stayed in Elvis's mind. A real one. He didn't know what that meant anymore. For so long, he had believed his job was to give people what they wanted. They wanted the king, so he became the king. They wanted romance. He gave them romance. They wanted excitement. He gave them excitement. They wanted perfection. He gave them perfection. But nobody ever asked, "What do you want?" And perhaps the most frightening part was that Elvis didn't know the answer. He had forgotten. A knock came at the door. Neither man moved. Another knock. "Elvis?" It was June. Johnny looked toward the door. "Come in." June opened it. She looked at both men. Her eyes softened. "I thought you two might still be talking." Johnny smiled. "We are." June walked inside. She looked at Elvis. "You okay?" Elvis nodded, then stopped. He shook his head. "No." June smiled gently. "Good." Elvis looked confused. "Good?" June nodded. "Now you're being honest." Johnny laughed quietly. Elvis smiled. For the first time that night, the room felt lighter. June sat down. The three of them talked. Not about music. Not about money. Not about television. Not about fame. They talked about fear, loneliness, faith, family, and the strange emptiness that sometimes appears when the whole world knows your name, but nobody knows your heart. Elvis listened. Then he said something that surprised even himself. "I want to go home." June asked. "Where?" Elvis looked at the silver cross in his hand. "Tupelo." Nobody spoke. He continued. "I haven't been there in a long time." Johnny nodded. "Maybe you should." Elvis looked at him. "Maybe." But the night wasn't finished. A television producer came rushing into the room. His face was pale. Elvis! Elvis looked up. What? The producer hesitated. The network is asking about the footage. Johnny frowned. What footage? The performance. Elvis's expression changed. What about it? The producer swallowed. They're asking whether we're keeping the recording. Silence. Elvis looked toward Johnny. Johnny looked back. The producer continued. It's already being called one of the most emotional performances we've ever captured. Elvis shook his head. I don't want it released. The producer nodded. Understood. He left. The door closed. Elvis leaned back. I can't let people see that. Johnny asked, Why? Elvis stared at him. Because they'll think I'm weak. Johnny smiled. No. Elvis frowned. They'll think you're human. Elvis looked away, and somehow that frightened him even more. The next morning, newspapers began talking. Some called the performance extraordinary. Others called it unexpected. Some reporters wrote about the tears. Others wrote about Johnny's dare. But behind the headlines was a deeper question. What had happened to Elvis Presley? Why had the most famous entertainer in America stood on stage and cried? Why had Johnny Cash joined him? Why had the entire auditorium become silent? Nobody outside that room knew the full story. They didn't know about the Silver Cross. They didn't know about Gladys. They didn't know about the dressing room conversation. They didn't know about the fear. They didn't know about the two men sitting in silence after the cameras stopped. And perhaps that was exactly what Elvis wanted. But Johnny wasn't convinced. Several days later, Johnny received a phone call. It was Elvis. Johnny answered. Hello? Silence. Then Elvis's voice. I've been thinking. Johnny smiled. That's dangerous. Elvis laughed softly. I mean it. I know. A pause. I went to see Mama's grave. Johnny became quiet. How was it? I don't know. Elvis breathed deeply. I stood there for a long time. What did you say? Elvis's voice became fragile. Nothing. Johnny waited. Then I finally said... Elvis stopped. Johnny didn't interrupt. I told her I was tired. Johnny closed his eyes. What happened? Nothing. Elvis laughed sadly. But for some reason, he paused. I felt better. Johnny smiled. Sometimes that's enough. Then Elvis said something unexpected. I want to sing gospel again. Johnny smiled. Then sing it. Not for a show. Then don't. Not for money? Good. Not for the record company. Johnny laughed. Definitely good. Elvis became quiet. I want to sing because I need it. Johnny answered immediately. Then you already know what to do. The call ended, but the decision remained. For the first time in years, Elvis was thinking about music as something that could heal him. Not something that could sell. Not something that could build his legend. Something that could keep him alive. Months passed. Elvis continued performing. The world continued demanding Elvis Presley. But something inside him had shifted. He began spending more time with gospel musicians. He returned to old songs, old hymns, old memories. Sometimes he would stop during rehearsals and simply listen. His band noticed. He was different. Not always happier, but more present. And whenever someone asked him why, he never gave a long explanation. He simply said, Johnny reminded me. Johnny changed too. The night in Nashville stayed with him. He had spent years believing that helping someone meant giving them advice. That night taught him something else. Sometimes helping someone meant standing beside them while they cried. No solution, no speech, no miracle, just presence. Johnny began speaking more openly about his own struggles. He talked about addiction, about shame, about faith, about the people who had stayed when he gave them every reason to leave. And audiences listened differently. Because now they knew something. The man in black wasn't pretending to have conquered darkness. He knew what it was to live inside it. Then came the final conversation. Months after the Nashville performance, Elvis and Johnny met again. No cameras, no audience, no stage. They sat outside late at night. The sky was dark. Johnny looked at Elvis. "You remember that night?" Elvis smiled. "How could I forget?" "Do you regret it?" Elvis thought for a long time. "No," Johnny nodded. "Me neither." Elvis looked toward the stars. "I was angry with you." "I know. I thought you embarrassed me." "You did." Elvis laughed. Johnny smiled. Then Elvis became serious. "But you saved something." Johnny looked at him. "What?" Elvis touched his chest. "This." Johnny said nothing. Elvis continued. "I think I was disappearing." Johnny nodded slowly. "I know. And you reminded me that I was still here." Johnny looked away. His eyes became wet. "That's all I ever wanted." Elvis frowned. "What?" "To remind you." The two men sat quietly. No applause, no cameras, no music, just silence. But it was a different kind of silence. Not empty, peaceful. Elvis looked toward Johnny. "You know what my mama used to say?" Johnny smiled. "What?" "She said gospel music could save a dying soul." Johnny looked at him. "And?" Elvis smiled. "The terrifying part," he paused, "is that she might have been right." Johnny laughed softly. "Maybe she was." Elvis nodded. "Yeah." Then he looked toward the darkness. "Maybe she was." And somewhere, years later, that night in Nashville would become more than a forgotten television performance. It would become a story about two men who had everything the world could offer and still felt empty. A story about grief, addiction, faith, friendship, and the terrifying courage it takes to let someone see the person behind the legend. But there was one thing nobody watching that night could have known. The cameras had captured everything. Every tear, every broken note, every moment of silence, every embrace, every word. And somewhere inside a vault, that recording was waiting for a future generation to see what really happened when Elvis Presley stopped being the king and became a wounded son again. Because one day, the world would finally see the footage. And when it did, millions would discover that the most powerful moment wasn't Elvis singing. It wasn't Johnny Cash crying. It wasn't even the audience standing. It was what happened after the cameras stopped. And in that private room, Elvis had whispered the truth he had been too afraid to say on stage. "I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending." Johnny had looked him in the eyes and answered, "Then don't pretend." Those two words would follow Elvis for the rest of his life. For years, the recording remained hidden, not forgotten, not destroyed, hidden. Deep inside an archive, behind locked doors and layers of paperwork, sat the footage from that Nashville night. The cameras had captured everything. Elvis Presley walking onto the stage with trembling hands. Johnny Cash standing beside him with tears streaming down his face. June Carter watching from the wings. 8,000 people rising slowly to their feet. And then the embrace. The moment when Elvis pulled Johnny close and Johnny whispered the words nobody expected to hear. "You saved my life tonight." For decades, almost nobody outside that auditorium knew how emotional that night had truly been. People heard rumors. They heard stories. Some said Elvis had broken down. Others claimed Johnny had challenged him. Some believed the entire thing had been carefully planned for television. But the truth was far more painful. It hadn't been planned. It hadn't been rehearsed. It hadn't been designed to become legendary. It had simply happened. Two men had stood beneath the lights with nowhere left to hide, and eventually, the world would see it. But before that happened, Elvis had to continue living with what the night had awakened inside him. The next morning, Nashville looked completely different. The rain had stopped. The streets were wet. Cars moved slowly through the city as newspapers appeared on sidewalks and outside restaurants. People were talking. Radio hosts were discussing the performance. Television producers were calling their offices. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. What had happened to Elvis Presley? Why had he cried? Why had Johnny Cash cried? Why had the audience become so silent? Why had the performance felt less like a concert and more like a church service? But Elvis wasn't reading the newspapers. He was sitting alone. A cup of coffee rested untouched in front of him. The silver cross was in his hand. He turned it over repeatedly. For years, that little piece of metal had been a reminder of his mother. Now it carried something else, a memory, a warning, a second chance. He thought about Tupelo, about the tiny house, about Gladys, about the way she used to sing. He remembered sitting beside her as a child. He remembered how she would close her eyes while singing gospel. She never cared whether the notes were perfect. She cared whether they were true. That was what Johnny had forced him to remember. Truth, not perfection, not fame, not image. Truth. Later that afternoon, Elvis called his mother in his mind again. Not literally, just in memory. He imagined her sitting across from him, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel guilty. He didn't ask why she had died. He didn't ask why he had become famous. He didn't ask why success hadn't made him happy. He simply remembered her, and that memory didn't hurt as much as before. It still hurt, but it wasn't destroying him anymore. It was becoming part of him. That was the difference. Grief had once been a prison. Now it was becoming a bridge back to the boy he used to be. Johnny Cash experienced his own change. The Nashville performance had forced him to confront something he had spent years avoiding. He had challenged Elvis because he recognized himself in him. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the addiction, the feeling of becoming a public character while the private person slowly disappeared. Johnny knew what it meant to smile for people while falling apart inside. And that night, standing beside Elvis, he realized something terrifying. Sometimes the person you are trying to save is also saving you. That was what happened between them. Neither man had planned it. Neither man expected it. But somehow, one broken soul had recognized another. And instead of looking away, they stayed. Weeks later, Elvis returned to a rehearsal studio. The room was filled with musicians, guitars, microphones, pianos, music stands, people waiting for instructions. Elvis walked in quietly. One of the musicians asked, "What are we rehearsing today?" Elvis looked around, then smiled. "Gospel." The room became still. He hadn't said that word casually. Everyone knew what it meant. Elvis picked up a microphone. No stage lights, no screaming fans, no television cameras, just musicians. He closed his eyes and began to sing. His voice wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It was honest. The musicians slowly joined him. And for a few minutes, Elvis wasn't performing. He was remembering. That became one of the most important changes in his life. He started making more room for music that meant something to him. Not because it would sell, not because someone demanded it, because it reminded him of where he came from. Sometimes, after rehearsals, he would sit alone with the musicians. They would talk about church, family, loss, faith, regret. And Elvis listened. He began asking questions, real questions, questions he had been too afraid to ask before. How do you know when you're lost? How do you know when you're becoming someone you don't recognize? How do you forgive yourself? There were no easy answers, but Elvis had stopped pretending there were. That alone was progress. Johnny noticed the change. One evening, the two men spoke again. Johnny asked, "You still carrying that cross?" Elvis smiled. "Always. You still thinking about your mama?" "Every day." Johnny nodded. "Does it hurt?" Elvis looked toward the window. "Sometimes." Then he smiled, but not like before. Johnny understood. That was healing. Not forgetting, not erasing, learning how to carry the memory without allowing it to crush you. But life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were still difficult nights, still pressure, still expectations, still people surrounding Elvis who wanted something from him. There were still days when he felt exhausted, still moments when the loneliness returned. But now he knew what it felt like to speak honestly. That was important, because once a person experiences freedom, pretending becomes harder. And Elvis had tasted freedom on that Nashville stage, even if it had terrified him. Then came the day the recording was nearly destroyed. A television executive reviewing old archives discovered the footage. He watched it privately. At first, he expected nothing unusual. Then Elvis appeared on the screen. The executive leaned forward. He watched Johnny Cash walk toward him. He watched Elvis begin singing. Then the tears came. The executive stopped the tape. He rewound it, watched again, and again. Finally, he called another producer. "You need to see this." The producer arrived. They watched together. Neither spoke. When the footage ended, the producer finally said, "This can't stay buried forever." But releasing it wasn't simple. There were rights, contracts, families, archives, permissions, and most importantly, there was the question of whether Elvis himself would have wanted the world to see it. That question stopped everything. Years passed. The world changed. Music changed. Television changed. Generations changed. But the story of that night survived. People who had been in the auditorium told their children. Those children told their friends. Musicians heard stories about the night Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash had stood together and turned a concert into something resembling a revival meeting. Some doubted the stories, others believed them, but everyone agreed on one thing. Something extraordinary had happened. Then, many years later, the archive was finally opened. The footage was carefully restored. The colors were cleaned. The sound was repaired. And the people preparing the release watched it from beginning to end. When the final image appeared, nobody spoke. They had expected history. Instead, they had witnessed humanity. The moment wasn't powerful because Elvis was famous. It was powerful because fame disappeared. The man remained. When the footage was finally shown publicly, audiences around the world reacted exactly as Johnny had predicted. People cried. Musicians stopped performances to talk about it. Young singers watched the footage repeatedly. Music teachers used it to explain something no textbook could teach. Emotion, courage, truth. The imperfections became the most beautiful part. Elvis's voice cracking. Johnny struggling to hold himself together. The silence between verses. The audience unsure whether to applaud. The moment June walked onto the stage. None of it was polished. And that was why it mattered. One young musician watching the footage later described it this way: "They weren't singing to impress us. They were singing because they needed somewhere to put their pain." That sentence spread quickly. People understood. Because everyone has pain. Not everyone has the courage to show it. And then came the moment that became the most replayed part of the entire recording. After the song. After the tears. After the embrace. Elvis stood alone beneath the lights. He looked toward the audience. Then he said, "My mama used to tell me that a man can have the whole world and still lose his soul if he forgets where he came from." The footage showed his face. No sunglasses, no smile, no performance. Just a tired man speaking from somewhere deep inside. Then he looked toward Johnny and said, "Tonight, this man reminded me." The audience remained silent, not because they didn't know how to react, because they didn't want the moment to end. Johnny Cash's response was equally simple. He stepped toward Elvis, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "You ain't alone." Those 3 words became the heart of the entire story. You ain't alone. Not in grief, not in addiction, not in fear, not in failure, not in loneliness, not in the battle to remember who you are. The message crossed generations. People who had never met Elvis, people who had never seen Johnny perform, people who knew nothing about Nashville. They understood. Because loneliness doesn't belong to one generation. Neither does hope. Years later, music students would gather around screens to study that footage. Their teachers would explain vocal technique, stage presence, breathing, harmony. But eventually, someone would always ask the same question: why does this performance feel different? And the answer was simple. Because they weren't trying to look strong. They were willing to be vulnerable. They allowed the audience to see the person underneath the legend. That is something very few performers ever do. There is another reason the story endured. It wasn't simply about Elvis Presley. It wasn't simply about Johnny Cash. It was about every person who has ever felt trapped inside an identity they didn't choose. The successful businessman who goes home exhausted. The mother who smiles for her children while secretly crying. The young musician who believes failure means the end. The father who never learned how to say he's hurting. The person surrounded by thousands of people who still feels completely alone. They all recognize themselves in that stage. And that was why the performance became bigger than music. The final image of the restored footage became unforgettable. Elvis stood beside Johnny. June stood nearby. The audience remained on its feet. The lights were bright. But the 3 people on stage looked strangely small beneath them. Human. Fragile. Alive. Elvis looked toward Johnny. Johnny looked back. Neither man smiled. They didn't need to. They already understood. Something had changed. Not the world. Not fame. Not the music business. Something inside them. And perhaps that is the real reason Johnny Cash dared Elvis Presley that night. It wasn't because Johnny wanted to embarrass him. It wasn't because he wanted headlines. It wasn't because he wanted to create a legendary television moment. He saw a man disappearing, and he was afraid. Afraid because he recognized the path. He had walked it himself. He knew where it could lead. So he opened a door. A terrifying door. A painful door. A door marked with grief. And he said, "Come through." Elvis almost didn't, but he did. And on the other side was something he hadn't felt in years. Himself. The world remembers Elvis Presley as the king. The world remembers Johnny Cash as the man in black. But for one night in Nashville, those titles disappeared. There was no king. There was no man in black. There were only 2 men. 2 wounded sons. 2 survivors. 2 voices. And 1 song. A song about grace. A song about being lost. A song about being found. And perhaps the greatest irony is that the audience came expecting entertainment. Instead, they witnessed something much rarer. A confession. A friendship. A moment of grace. The camera slowly fades back to the old Nashville stage. The seats are empty now. The lights are off. The microphones are gone. But you can almost imagine the sound still hanging in the air. Elvis's trembling voice, Johnny's deep harmony, the audience breathing together, June crying backstage, and somewhere in the silence, the words remain. You ain't alone. The narrator speaks softly. They came to hear legends sing, but that night, the legends stopped singing long enough to become human. The screen slowly fades. A photograph appears. Young Elvis, young Johnny. Two men before the world turned them into icons. Then the photograph changes. The Nashville stage. The embrace. The tears. The crowd standing. The final image becomes the silver cross in Elvis's hand. The camera slowly pulls away, and the narrator continues, Elvis thought he had lost the little boy from Tupelo. Johnny thought he had spent his life running from the man he used to be. But somewhere between one broken note and one trembling harmony, they found each other. A pause. And sometimes, that's what saving someone really looks like. The music becomes softer. You don't rescue them with money. You don't rescue them with fame. You don't rescue them by pretending everything will be okay. Sometimes, you simply stand beside them and remind them. The screen turns completely black. Then one final sentence appears. You ain't alone. The words remain on screen, then slowly disappear. And the final narration whispers, My mama used to tell me that gospel music could save a dying soul. A long pause. Maybe she was right. The music fades. The story ends. But the question remains for everyone watching. Who in your life is quietly disappearing behind a smile? Maybe they don't need you to fix them. Maybe they don't need advice. Maybe they simply need someone brave enough to stand beside them and say, You ain't alone.